Have you heard anything about Islamic philosophy before? If you don't, let's watch this video. Islamic philosophy is a branch of Islamic studies that has a long sought to unify philosophy or reason with Islamic religious teaching or faith. Okay, the main sources of classical or early Islamic philosophy are the religion itself, especially ideas derived and interpreted from the Quran, and then Greek philosophy, which the early Muslim inherited as a result of conquest when the Alexandria, Syria, and also Jundishapur came under Muslim rule, and also pre-Islamic Iranian and Indian philosophy. Early Islamic thought, there were two main groups, Kalam, which focus on theology, and also Falsafa, which focus on interpretation of Aristotelian and also Neoplatonism. So from the 9th century onward, owing to Caliph al-Ma'mun and his successor, Greek philosophy was extended to the Persians and also Arab. And then, moreover, the peripatetic school was represented by Al-Hindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and also Ibn Rushd. During the Abbasid Caliphate in Spain, Arabic philosophic literature translated into Hebrew and Latin, transmitted Greek, Hindu, and other pre-Islamic knowledge to the Christian West, and helped to make Aristotle known in Christian Europe. Islamic philosophy influenced Judaic and Christian thinkers and also contributed to the development of modern European philosophy. And then Ibn Rushd's ideas on the separation of philosophy and religion further developed by the average school of philosophy in Europe, in which were later influenced in the development of modern secularism. If you want to know more about the Islamic philosophy, stay tuned. My friends will explain more about it. Over to you, Bhavani.
Thank you, Farhana. Moving on to the differences of Kalam and Falsafa. But before that, let us take a look on what is Kalam and what is Falsafa, before distinguishing them in three main aspects. So let's start with Kalam. So Kalam is the Islamic tradition of philosophical theology based on rational argumentation and debate. It is used to interpret certain beliefs and teachings within the Quran and Hadith. A scholar of Kalam can be referred to as a mutakalamin. With Kalam, questions about surah and hadith as well as Islamic science and law, for instance like the fiqh and sharia, begin to be investigated beyond the scope of Muhammad's belief. Independent minds exploiting the methods of ijtihad sought to investigate the doctrines of Quran, which until then had been accepted on the authority of divine revelation. Quran has some basic theological teachings like the idea of Tawheed, and there were few questions or some of the most prominent theological questions relating to it, such as the attribute of God, the nature of Quran and its revelations, free will versus determinism, nature of faith and sin, and many more. So that is the meaning of Kalam. So let's move on to the meaning of Falsafa. On 9th century onward, Greek philosophy was introduced among the Arabs, and the peripatetic school, or known to be the Aristotelian school, began to find representatives among them, such as Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd, all of whose fundamental principles were considered as criticized by the mutakalamin. A number of thinkers and scientists, some of them were heterodox Muslim or known to be non-Muslims, played a very vital role in transmitting Greek, Hindu, and other pre-Islamic knowledges to Christian West. They contributed in making Aristotle known in the Christian Europe. Three speculative thinkers, namely Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Al-Kindi, combined Aristotelianism and Neoplatonism with other ideas introduced through Islam. So, now that we know what is Kalam and what is Falsafa, let's take a look on the differences between Kalam and Falsafa. There are many differences that we can see between Kalam and Falsafa. However, today, we are going to be distinguishing them in three main aspects. So let's start with the first aspect. So the first aspect is about the emphasis on the source. For Kalam scholars, they emphasize largely on the use of Quran and Hadith. Meanwhile, for the philosophers, they put in a large emphasis on Greek text. So let's move on to the second aspect, which is about the idea on the unity of God. As for Kalam, the Mutakalamin therefore sought to establish a system of philosophy which would demonstrate the creation of matter, and they adopted the theory of atoms as enunciated by Democritus. Atoms were created by God, and God continues to create them as occasion requires it. Therefore, as we can see, Kalam scholars accepted the idea on the unity of God. Meanwhile, as for Falsafa or the philosophers, matter was eternal and that God could not be the creator of the world. God's knowledge extends only to the general laws of the universe and not to the individual and accidental things, which is more or less to denying prophecy. So, the third aspect or the last aspect is about the immortality of the individual human soul. As for Kalam, the active intellect is a superhuman entity emanating from God and enlightening the human mind, not a part of any individual human soul. So therefore, they accepted and supported the immortality of individual human soul. However, the philosophers or the falsafa, according to Aristotelianism, human soul cannot exist apart from the body and only the active intellect can exist apart from the body. Therefore, as we can see, Aristotle's theory seems to deny the immortality of individual human soul. So that's all from me. Now I will pass it to Sarah Auni to continue the presentation. Here you go.
Now, let's see two of the most influential Islamic philosophers, Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. Firstly, Abu Nasr Al-Farabi, also known as Al-Farabi, was an Islamic philosopher and scientist. He was referred to in the Arab world as the second teacher after Aristotle because of his extensive commentaries on Aristotle and his work in logic. In philosophy world, he was the first Islamic philosopher to make a distinction between philosophy and religion. Claiming that reason based on intellectual perception was superior to revelation and imagination, he gave precedence to reason over revelation as a source of truth and guidance in the practical aspects of life, such as politics and sociology. He saw religion as a symbolic rendering of the truth and aimed to reconcile the teachings of the Quran with philosophical truth. Al-Farabi is best known for his Neoplatonist ideas, but he was also an Aristotelian. In terms of metaphysics, he is also recognized as the father of Islamic Neoplatonism. He replaced the Quranic doctrine of creation ex nihilo with a Neoplatonic theory of the emanation of the universe from a divine being as the first, in whom essence and existence are absolutely one. From this first divine being emanates the first intellect, which is the second. The first intellect, an immaterial substance, comprehends God and consequently produces a second intellect. It also comprehends its own essence and produces the body and soul of As-Sama Al-Ula, the first heaven. Each of the succeeding emanated intellects is associated with the generation of other astral phenomena such as the stars and the planets. The 10th intellect is the agent or active intellect, which both emanates form to mind and the sublunary world and actualizes thought in the mind of man. Al-Farabi also employed the Neoplatonic method of describing the divine in terms of negative attributes such as indivisible and indefinable. Next is Ibn Sina. Abu Ali al-Husayn ibn Abdullah ibn Sina, often referred to by his Latinized name Avicenna, was a Persian physician, philosopher and scientist. He was one of the major Islamic philosophers, and his philosophical writings had a profound impact on Islamic philosophy and on medieval European scholasticism. Avicenna integrated the ideas and methodologies of Aristotle Neoplatonism, and other Greek philosophy with monotheistic tradition of Islam. Avicenna adopted Neoplatonism's theory of emanation, but he made a distinction between God and the creation in order to avoid the Neoplatonist tendency towards pantheism. He was one of the first to apply philosophical logic to Islamic theology, and his writing provoked a strong reaction from later Islamic theologians. In philosophy world, Avicenna is one of the foremost Islamic philosophers and one of the first to attempt a correlation between philosophy and religion. He expounded the Neoplatonic concept of emanation, but rejected other Neoplatonic ideas such as the pre-existence of the soul and used Aristotelian logic to develop his arguments. Next is his concept on logic and knowledge. Avicenna employed logic in the service of metaphysics as a means of understanding Islamic religious doctrine and even interpreting the Quran. Logic was a standard for judging concepts acquired through the four faculties of reasons: sense, perception, retention, imagination, and estimation. Among these, imagination was the key since it could compare and relate new phenomena to existing concepts. Logic could also be used to make deductions and acquire new knowledge and to judge the validity of arguments. Gaining knowledge was essential to training and perfecting the intellect in order to attain salvation.
Thank you, Sarah. So now, I will discuss on the example of study under Islamic philosophy, especially on the topic of logic. Islamic logic was inspired primarily by Aristotle's corpus, the organon, which according to a late Greek taxonomy also included the rhetoric and poetic. Based on Islamic sources, some of element in stoic logic and linguistic theory and dialogical sources included not only Aristotle's own works, but also the works of late Greek Aristotelian commentators such as logical writing of Galen. However, most of logical work of Islamic philosophers remains squarely within the traditions of Aristotelian logic, and most of their writing in this area were in the form of commentaries on Aristotle. Based on Islamic philosophers, logic included not only the study of formal pattern of inference and their validity, but also element of the philosophy of language and even of epistemology and metaphysics. Since logic was viewed as an instrument by which to acquire knowledge, logic in the Islamic world also incorporated a general theory of argumentation focused upon epistemological aim. Furthermore, the Islamic philosophers' aim was ultimately to demonstrate necessary and certain truth, where the use of dialectical and rhetorical argument was accounted for as foundation to demonstration as defensive of its conclusion. So now, let's take a look on the Islamic philosophers in terms of subject matter and the aim of logic. However, today we are going to discuss only on the view of two Islamic philosophers, which are Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. Islamic philosophers devoted considerable attention to identifying the subject matter studied by logic and aim at which logical studies are directed. For example, Al-Farabi constructed the majority of his philosophical output to epitomize the approach to logic and is characteristic of Islamic Aristotelianism. In his Isa al-Ulum, he defined logic as an instrumental, rule-based science aimed at directing the intellect toward the truth and safeguarding it from error in its act of reasoning. He defended the need for such a science of reasoning on the ground that it is possible for the mind to err in at least some of its acts. In addition, Al-Farabi compared logic to tools such as ruler and compasses, which are used to ensure exactness when we measure physical objects subject to the error of sensation. Like this tool, logical measure can be employed by the user to verify both their own act of reasoning and the argument of others. Al-Farabi's view of logic as rule-based science which govern the mind operation over intelligible is repeated in many of his introductory logical work, and it formed the foundation of Ibn Sina's later refinement. In the opening chapter of his Al-Madkhal, Ibn Sina described the purpose of logic as one of enabling the intellect to acquire knowledge of the unknown from the known. Moreover, in the Ilahiyat of Al-Shifa, Ibn Sina introduced the terminology of first and second intention in order to express the relation between the concept of these essence themselves. For example, the second intentions of being a subject and being a predicate are studied in logic independently of whatever first intention function as the subject and predicate terms in a given proposition. To understand this more by imagine human being and rational animal in the proposition a human being is a rational animal. Therefore, the logical second intention depend upon the first intention because the first intention are the conceptual building block of the new knowledge which second intention link together. Thus, we can see how these two philosophers defend the need for logical by arguing that the innate capacity of reasoning are insufficient to ensure the attainment of this purpose, and thus they require the aid of an art. That's all from me. I'll pass to Christina to discuss on our next subtopic.
Thank you, Farisha. Now, I will be talking about the difference between Islamic philosophy and Western philosophy. The main difference between Islamic philosophy and Western philosophy is that the Western philosophy does not pay attention to traditional logic or the intellect, or rather gives not much cognitive value to it. On the contrary, the entire arguments of Islamic philosophy are based on intellect and logic. Thus, this leads to where Western philosophers are free to criticize other schools and produce new arguments and theories, while Islamic philosophers have to follow traditional logic or values to produce new arguments and theories. Next, I will be explaining regarding the relevance of Islamic philosophy to science and religion. First of all, Islamic philosophy occupied a remarkable historical and epistemic position in intellectual history in Islam, in terms of being situated in between science and religion, and also in seeking to devise ways by which their commensurability can be demonstrated in view of emphasizing the harmonization of their relationships, connections, and distinctions. Islamic philosophers aimed at reconciling ancient Greek science and logic with religious thinking and practice in Islam. They endeavored to prove that the sources of antique wisdom confirmed the revealed religious truth and that science assisted in uncovering the ultimate principles of reality, including of the human condition in a manner that is complementary and commensurable with religious revelation as well as the exegesis and hermeneutics of scripture. In addition, Islamic philosophers brought also a mystical tendency or orientation in explicating the bearings of the sciences and their contribution to the affirmation of the articles of faith through rational reasoning and logical forms of inference, and also by way of empirical along with mathematically grounded methods of demonstration. Furthermore, Islamic philosophy offered an ideal framework for bringing science and religion to bear onto one another without reducing them into each other. Besides, the philosophy in Islamic intellectual history mediated the relationships and tensions between science and religion, while raising ontological interrogations and epistemological questions concerning their theoretical underpinnings and conceptual structures. Hence, philosophizing in connection with religion and science in Islamic civilization assumed a metaphysical stance regarding the positive character of the axiomatic parameters of science and religion, in the sense of self-identifying itself as the unrestricted mode of thinking, which is reflective and critical in essence. That's all from me. Now, Farhana will continue with the conclusion.
Thank you, Kisina. So from this video, we could say that Islamic philosophy seeks to reconcile philosophy with Islam religious teaching. Then, Kalam is the Islamic tradition of philosophical theology based on rational argumentation and debate which interpret certain beliefs and also teaching within the Quran and also Hadith. Meanwhile, falsafa or philosophy focusing on Greek philosophy which was introduced to find representatives such as Al-Hindi, Al-Farabi, Ibn Sina and also Ibn Rushd, whose principles were considered as criticized by the Mutakaamin. Next, Al-Farabi was the first Islamic philosopher to make distinction between philosophy and also religion. Okay, Al-Farabi, as the father of Neoplatonism, gave precedence to reason over revelation as a source of truth and also guidance in the practical aspect of life, while Ibn Sina, on the other hand, was one of the first to attempt correlation between philosophy and also religion. So he adopted Neoplatonism theory of emanation but rejected other Neoplatonic ideas such as the pre-existence of the soul and used Aristotelian logic to develop his argument. Okay, then Islamic logic was inspired by primarily on the tradition of Aristotelian logic, and also most of their writing in this area were in the form of commentaries on Aristotle. So based on Islamic philosophy, logic included not only the study of formal patterns of inference and their validity, but also elements of the philosophy of language and even of epistemology and metaphysics, or can be categorized as the aid of an art. So according to Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, logic can be argued that the innate capacities of reasoning are insufficient to ensure the attainment of this purpose. Therefore, it required the aid of an art. So for Al-Farabi, he defines logic as an instrumental, rule-based science aimed at directing the intellect towards the truth and safeguarding it from errors in its act of reasoning. Furthermore, Ibn Sina describes the purpose of logic as one of enabling the intellect to acquire knowledge of the unknown from the known. Okay, as for the differences between Islamic philosophy and Western philosophy, the primary differences is that the arguments of Islamic philosophy are based on intellect and also logic, while the Western philosophy does not pay attention to traditional logic and also the intellect. And then, in terms of the relevance of Islamic philosophy to science and religion, Islamic philosophy provided an ideal framework for bringing science and also religion to have effect upon one another without reducing them to one another. And it also resolved the tensions between science and also religion while raising epistemological and ontological questions about their conceptual structure. From us, so we hope that this video will help you to further understand about the Islamic philosophy. Thank you. Bye.